So fortifications are looking easy to include and flyer wing is gone. Today we're talking new detachment rules and how I think they'll impact on army building in 9th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Continuing our look at 9th edition 40k in this video, we're going to be taking a look at new detachments and building your army with them. So we'll look at each detachment option in turn, talk a bit about its effects in game, talk about what's got better or worse since 8th edition, and how I think it will impact on people actually constructing armies. Let's jump straight into it. So in the new 9th edition rulebook there are 11 different detachments that you can choose from. It's dropped from previous as we've now lost the air wing detachment. I think broadly speaking they fall into 3 different categories. First we have what we call core detachments, the patrol, battalion and brigade. Then more sort of spam detachments, which you mainly take to be able to get a lot of one particular slot. Then a bunch of the others including super heavy ones, supreme command, fortifications and auxiliary support. For the core ones, the actual composition of the detachments hasn't changed in terms of what units that you can take in them, but of course it costs you command points to take the detachments rather than gaining them. Patrols cost 2, battalions cost 3, and brigades cost 4. If you do happen to have your warlord in one of these detachments though, then the cost of the detachment is refunded, so I think that most people will choose to build a list around these sort of detachments, as it's basically giving you a big reward for putting your warlord in these ones. They also gain you access to a fairly wide array of different slot types, so should allow you a fair few units of whatever particular thing that you wanted to bring in your army. I think patrols have become a lot more useful. Now they're basically just as good as a battalion or brigade, particularly for very elite armies that don't need too many slots. And also the Drukhari special rule could also come in handy for patrols, as now you really are incentivized to take 3 of them, as that will give you access to a whole load of different slots, tailoring detachments within the army, and you'll still get maximum CP. From there, the battalion requires a bit more of a commitment, but it does buy you more slots to access than the patrol, and then the brigade requires lots of different units, but of course means that you have a large amount of slots to play with, and means you could really go nuts on any one of them. From there we have the more spammy type detachments, which I think generally won't be played as people's first detachments for the most part, because the command point cost isn't refunded if your warlord's in the detachment. These again are the same as before in terms of numbers. You need 1 HQ and 3 of any of the elite's heavy or fast attack choices to unlock them, and they'll cost you 3 command points for each one. Basically after most people have started with a core detachment, I think this could be a good solid option for a second one, as you only need one other HQ choice, and from there you can just pick the slot that you want the most of. All of these detachments can't take any understrength units, that's just an auxiliary support, and every single one can take 0 to 2 flyers in them, which is now the only way that you can access flyers outside of auxiliary support. There was that other minor change as well to transports. Now you can only take 1 dedicated transport per infantry unit in the detachment, which to be honest isn't going to be very limiting, as most HQ choices are infantry units, and most codexes have access to at least some cheap infantry. I don't see it as being particularly restrictive, even if you do want to spam transports. Next we move on to the slightly more irregular type detachments. The Supreme Command detachment is radically changed, only allowing 1 HQ or Lord of War choice in it. It must be your warlord, and they can only be Primarchs or models with the Supreme Commander tag. At the moment no models have the Supreme Commander tag, so I suspect it's something that's coming in the 9th edition FAQs. Likely being handed out to certain powerful individuals within certain factions, likely Abaddon the Despoiler, maybe Commander Shadowsgun or Ghazghkull from the Orcs. Basically this Supreme Command is going to allow you to use one of these powerful models as your HQ choice without penalising you in command points. It costs 0 CP to field, and if you've included one of the core type detachments in your army, then you'll get the command point cost for that core detachment refunded. So basically you're not losing out by making, say, Guilliman your warlord. If you took a Space Marine battalion along, you still get the maximum 12 command points, plus Guilliman's warlord ability. This quite radical shake-up does mean that it's no longer anywhere near as easy to spam HQ choices compared with what it was. If you want more HQ choices now, they are going to be tied alongside other units in any of the core detachments or spam detachments. Super heavies are also a little bit harder to access than they were before. You now need to pay a whopping 6 command points to be able to include a trio of super heavies in your list. Say if you were Imperial Guard and wanted to run a trio of Lords of Wars alongside your warlord in a core detachment. If you have non-Titanic Lords of War in the detachment and nothing but, it only costs 3 command points, so it wouldn't be quite as extortionate to ally in 3 Imperial Knight Armigers for example. Imperial and Chaos Knights sort of treat this as a core detachment. If their warlord is from this detachment, then you get that massive 6 command point cost refunded, meaning that you could still be starting on 4 command points if you were running just 1 Lord of War detachment in your Imperial Knight army. If you are using multiple knights now, then you're heavily incentivized to make one of them your warlord. Otherwise, with the loss of the Supreme Command, the only other option for fielding Super Heavies is a Super Heavy Auxiliary Detachment, where you pay 3 command points for the price of fielding 1 Super Heavy. It's quite a hefty price, and of course in a single Super Heavy Auxiliary Detachment, you don't usually get anything like regimental traits or chapter tactics or the like. So if you choose to go this way, then it's going to be paying a pretty hefty command point cost, as well as the points cost that you take for fielding it, and it might still be a little bit subpar in terms of not having those regimental traits, household traits, or whatever. The Fortification Detachment has received a bit of a buff though in my mind. It only costs you 1 command point to take anywhere between 1 and 3 fortifications, so it's a fairly cheap little addition if you did want to run some in your army. Interestingly enough, they've made faction-specific fortifications quite easy to field now. Basically you get the command point that you paid to access the detachment refunded if it's the same as your Warlord's faction. So say if you were Eldari and using the Webway Gate fortification, then that would be free in terms of command points. I don't think that people will be using up all their 3 detachments at 2,000 points quite as regularly as before, so I think that fortifications might start to come back in a little bit, at least in any sort of competitive games. They were very rarely used in 8th edition. Finally, the auxiliary support is 2 command points. That'll access you any non-fortification, non-Lord of War choice. You better be really sure that you want that unit if you're forking out 2 command points for it, as they could be put to very good use elsewhere. This slot can include understrength units, though I don't think it's usually going to be viable to do so, just for the hefty command point price tag that you're paying. I think auxiliary support will have very niche uses, only when it makes a lot of sense to include one hefty unit that really complements the rest of your army's playstyle. Or perhaps if you just don't want to pay the points for an extra HQ, when you really just need 1 extra unit slot unlocked from a patrol or something. So what does this mean for army building then? I generally think that the command point change is going to be a buff to armies that struggle to fill out multiple battalions, particularly more elite ones such as Space Marines or Custodies for example, but perhaps a comparative nerf to those that could easily fill them out and already had the command point bonus, such as Imperial Guard or Orcs. In terms of specific slots, I think that troops will change in role quite a bit in 9th. It's basically going to be highly rewarded to have a few troops in your list to fill out that initial core detachment, as that's going to be the easiest way to getting maximal command points in your army. But fielding masses and masses of troops is no longer going to be rewarded command point wise, as spamming battalions for command points is just no longer a thing. HQs are a little bit harder to spam due to the change to the Supreme Command detachment. Lords of War are being more penalised than they were in 8th edition to my mind. You did have some slight opportunity costs with fielding Lord of War detachments over being able to take more battalions for more command points, but it's nowhere near quite as bad as automatically going 6 command points down if you're say taking 3 Baneblades along. It's also nowhere near as easy to access these guys' regimental traits or household traits as was before, again due to the change to the Supreme Command detachments. Fortifications will be seen more regularly, particularly as I think a lot of armies won't be filling out the full 3 detachments, so it won't be kind of seen as wasting a detachment slot to include fortifications in the list, as I think a lot of lists will only be using 1 or 2 detachments in the first place, and fortification detachments will either be cheap for 1 command point, or free if they're the same as your Warlord's detachment. Flyers will be harder to field quite as optimally as they were before. You can no longer just take them in a fly wing detachment, and then choose the exact trait that is best for those particular flyers, such as say Cabal of the Black Heart for Dark Eldar flyer spam. They're now going to have to coordinate with your ground forces just that little bit better. And now if you are playing with 3 detachments, then you're only going to be able to get 6 flyers at maximum in a 2k list if you do bring 3 different detachments. Flyer spam is certainly hit hard by this, and they'll now have to be more hybrid type lists where they have a pretty hefty amount of ground forces as well. There's also a bit of a new tension between taking detachments with special rules that really benefit the units in them, compared with just taking fewer detachments and getting more command points. For example, taking units with a regiment or legion trait that was best for combat units, and then putting all the assault units in that detachment, and then having another detachment where all the rules benefited shooter units, and putting all the big guns in your army in that detachment. It's now just going to be a little bit more pinched whether or not it's worth having 2 different detachments in the first place, if it is going to cost you something like 3 command points for the privilege. So how might this translate into armies that people actually field in game? I do feel that it's heavily incentivized for people to actually start with one of those core type detachments, as it just seems like a relatively painless way of getting a fair few command points into your list, particularly as the entry level for one of these could be very low indeed, just with 1 HQ and 1 troops for a patrol, even if you're a very elite faction. From there you basically got almost 3 choices of Supreme Command detachments or fortifications for the faction, as neither of these would cost you any command points in addition to what you've already spent. To be honest, I think both Supreme Commanders and Fortifications are a little bit niche in their use, but if either of them do fit in with your battle plan, then the detachment rules basically mean that it's pretty much free to include them, at least in command points. From there you basically have the advantage of weighing up whether you prefer to have more detachments and fewer command points, or fewer detachments and more command points. For example, you could certainly build, say, a Space Marine list based around just one battalion, and that would give you maximum command points, but say if you really wanted to include some more heavy guns, and not just be limited to just 3 heavy support choices, then an extra spearhead might well be a worthwhile include, and it could be worth paying 3 command points for, rather than either being very limited in terms of detachment slots, or filling out all the way to a brigade, which is really going to limit exactly what you can take. Even if you could fit everything in one detachment, it might still be worth it to split them off into 2 different detachments, again just to put the units in their relative optimised detachments. For example, if you had a Sisters of Battle list, and you wanted to include most of your army in Valorous Heart, which is incredibly tough, but you really wanted to field all of your combat units in the order of the Bloody Rose, which gives you significant advantage to getting stuck in close combat. You can of course go down the complete opposite philosophy and just literally take all of the biggest, most optimised units in the game, and not worry about the command points too much. Even if you did just want to field nothing but heavy guns in the army to try and blow away the enemy with a massive alpha strike, an army list containing just 2 spearheads will still provide you 6 command points, plus the CP generated within the game, which is far more than it would do in 8th edition. It might not look quite as obvious compared with the command point benefits of going for battalions and things, but I still think these SKU list type things will be very viable in 9th, just because sometimes it is going to be better to have less command points and pick literally the most optimised units in the game. If you're Imperium as well, you could certainly soup over multiple different detachments. There's no additional penalty for bringing in allies from other codexes now, so you could take some AdMech Scorpius Disintegrators, plus some Imperial Guard tank commanders, plus some Sisters of Battle Exorcists, if that happens to be what is good in 9th. Obviously we're going to have to wait for the points cost to work out what is the best. I'm not sure if they really have hit soup on the head quite as hard as they thought they might have, seeing as you could still say field a Sisters of Battle battalion, plus say an AdMech and Imperial Guard spearheads all in the same army, and provided the Sisters model is the Warlord, then you'd still get 6 command points. Otherwise, I'm certainly expecting to see less fly spam type lists and fewer allied super heavies compared with previously. And we might also see people trying to build to make better use of the secondaries in the standard Games Workshop missions, much as they do for ITC at the moment. So let me know what you think of the detachment rules in the comments below, and how it might change your army's construction going from 8th to 9th. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics for more 40k tactics related content coming out every day. And if you have been enjoying the videos recently, I'd just like to mention that I do have a Patreon page, which is down in the video description below. The channel's Patreon is what allows me to spend quite so much time making these videos, so if you are enjoying regularly, then any support is really appreciated. Channel Patrons also get to see videos early each week, including this one, which I'm going to be uploading for pre-release. There's regular polls to see what sort of videos come next on the channel, and there's regular giveaway prize draws each month, and the Patreon is one way to sign up to that. This month we're giving away 3 copies of that new Indomitors box. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help out the channel, then the link is in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.